You are watching the Daisy Cousens Show. Well, today marks the decision in the landmark Tickle v. Giggle case in which Roxy Tickle, a trans activist and a male person, sued women's rights activist Sall Grover for removing Roxy from an app called Giggle for Girls, which Sall created as a space for women that is adult human females to socialize, network, date, and do all the things that women like to do. And unfortunately for Sall, she lost the case. Now, this was, in my opinion, an unfortunate but sadly expected decision by Justice Robert Bromwich, considering the nature of Australia's Sex Discrimination Act, who found that Sall Grover and the Giggle app had indirectly discriminated against Roxy Tickle on the grounds of gender identity. Unfortunate because, among other things, Justice Bromwich found in his judgment that sex, as in biological sex, is changeable. Well, that's an interesting position to come to, and possibly it doesn't work unless, of course, you conflate sex with gender, which, at least in Australian law with the Sex Discrimination Act, is what the law says. Well, joining us to dissect this strange and unfortunate situation is the woman herself, the founder of Giggle for Girls, the incomparable Sall Grover. Sall, welcome to the program. It's been a little while since we last spoke. How are you doing after today's decision?
Oh, there's not that many days in your life that you have a court tell you that, males can be female and sex can be changed. So it's unique, definitely. But I mean, this was a judgment that was unfortunately expected, as you said, due to the nature of the muddled Sex Discrimination Act that we're dealing with. So.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Australia's Sex Discrimination Act. Julia Gillard changed it in 2013, didn't she, to basically be not about biological sex and more about gender identity. Can you explain to our viewers, just so they have a little bit of a background, what the nature of that Sex Discrimination Act is?
Sure. So the Sex Discrimination Act in Australia was brought in 1984, and it's because we became a signatory with CEDAW, which is the UN's Convention of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is essentially like an international Bill of Rights for women. So once we signed it, we enlivened it in law with the Sex Discrimination Act. And it was, obviously an act for women, for females, and that wasn't very controversial at the time. Cut to 2013, that under the Julia Gillard's government, they did amendments that took out the definition of man and woman from the act and added in gender identity. So essentially what it did is muddle the act, and then you've got activists that have sort of captured institutions like the Australian Human Rights Commission to basically just argue that gender identity has more weight than biological sex in the Sex Discrimination Act, which, in my opinion, is like a completely absurd position to take, because why even call it the Sex Discrimination Act? But here we are. And, it is one of those things that, Julia Gillard has dined out for 10 years now on being Australia's first female prime minister, obviously very clear of what a woman is at the time, and the significance of being a woman leader of a country. And while she was giving, her sort of famous misogyny speech, and you're saying that she would not be lectured on what misogyny is by a man, in the background was taking out any legal protections for women and girls. And now, officially as of today, in Australia, women do not exist as a sex class at all. We are just a thought. Any man can claim to be a woman. We don't kind of exist in law, essentially, as a unique category of human beings, despite in reality being a separate category of human beings from men.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, it's like out of some dystopian novel, but it's reality. So I reckon that what this judgment has exposed really is that the law itself is just, well, as the saying goes, the law is an ass. I mean, do you think people will realize that from this decision?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, most of us are just living our lives, aren't we? And we're not focusing on the law every day, and it's quite boring. So who on earth would sit there and just constantly read the Sex Discrimination Act just to make sure if men are considered women or not? But, the reality is, the hard reality is sort of you find out the hard way that, laws are being changed in stealth. Like there's been no votes on this or anything. None of us have really known about it. That they, changed the law in a way that doesn't reflect reality. I think that that's the biggest issue for me, because when you've got laws reflecting reality and how society actually functions, then laws should actually work pretty well. But there is clearly a conflict here that needs to have a resolution, and that has not happened today. I mean, the Australian Human Rights Commission, for example, says that, they're against discrimination, and this is such a great verdict because, it just shows that discrimination is wrong. And you're like, well, hang on a second. Are women not being discriminated against because they have to see men as women, that we have to have men in women's spaces and women's sport? Like, there is still discrimination. In a sense, if you're going to have any category that's catering to a specific group, discrimination is actually completely necessary. And sometimes it's a really positive thing. So say if you're going to do something exclusively for women, by definition, you have to exclude men. So to be told that we have to include men just because they claim to be a woman, this just doesn't reflect how society actually functions. We still require female-only spaces in sport. It's that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, the vast majority of males will agree with that. Like that's what's bizarre. Like most women and men go, yeah, that's duh. But still, we have this sort of activist class that seems to think otherwise, that have infiltrated the law. And look, on the issue of identity, I'm sure you know Parnell McGuinness. She's a great commentator. She appears in a lot of things. She's been keeping an eye on this case, and she pointed out there's this big emphasis on the identity of trans women, but it's like women, as in women, adult human females, simply aren't afforded the same weight to their gender identity. Do you think that's a good point?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I wouldn't use the phrase gender identity because I don't think it exists in any real meaningful way, but just women have become we are now a subgroup of our own sex class, and the men who have invaded our sex class have more rights than us. And can demand more. I mean, no one makes decisions in their life actually on the basis of gender identity. When you're like, say, in your 20s, and, you go to a bar and you're looking for a significant other and you see someone from across the room, you don't like go, oh, what's their gender identity? The human brain recognizes sex instantly, and that it then has a response to your sexual orientation. We make so many decisions in our life on the basis of sex, whether we're aware of them or we're not. And that's why the law should be reflected with sex, because that's how it's working. That's how it works out there in reality. We don't make decisions on gender identity unless you're a man who claims to be a woman. But incidentally, they also make decisions based on sex, because there's a lot of men who claim to be women who claim to be lesbians. And that means that they know very well that biological sex still matters. So everyone else is allowed to acknowledge it except for us, the women who need to.
Yes, and that's the strange thing, isn't it? I mean, I've seen, biological males claiming to be trans women, claiming to be lesbians, and then calling lesbians transphobic for not wanting to sleep with them because they object to them having male genitalia, which apparently is transphobic. I mean, like this whole thing, Sal, has just become so completely crazy. And I'm really hoping, and I'm sure it will, this case will expose a lot of that crazy. And look, I don't know how much you're allowed to say legally, but are you able to give us an idea of maybe what the next steps are here for Tickle v. Giggle? What will the next stage be, if any?
So I've always said that my intention is to see it the whole way through, and that remains. So the whole way through would be seeing it all the way to the High Court. So just at the moment, my legal team is going to look at the judgment, and we will make decisions based on that. But we're only a few hours out from, we're 7 hours out from the judgment. So it's like we don't know yet. But we'll get there. And no, I mean, my intention has always been to take it to the High Court. I'm not going to give up a fight sort of halfway through it. And, women don't have our rights back yet. So we have to get them back. Like I have to have rights like everybody else. And at the moment, we just don't. It's just that simple. I mean, literally, basically the judgment is that women have to be forced to have men in female-only spaces. Thereby, female-only spaces no longer exist in this country. Any man can just come in. A man can just come into a woman's change room and locker room, wherever. And so long as he says he's a woman, there's absolutely nothing that we can do.
Yeah, but he doesn't even have to present as a woman. He can just walk in. You can have a big bearded lumberjack walk in and say, "Hello, I'm a woman. Allow me into your change room, you bigot." And that's legal. Like that.
Yeah.
That is the insanity of it. So, Sall, like, thank you so much for the work you do. All the very, very best with the continuation of this case. We will be watching it closely here on ADHTV. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope you can get some rest tonight. It's been a massive time for you, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you so much, Daisy.